Hi, boys and girls. I'm going to read to you the last 3 chapters of the Boxcar Children. It is chapter 11, and then 12, and then 13. I put up my son's different stuffies so that you can see all the ones I have at home here, and some of them are in the closet yet. But this is a collection of their stuffed animals, so enjoy them. Take a look at those dragons in the back. Here is chapter 11. The doctor takes a hand. I'm going to show you the picture. They're just black and white, aren't they? The days went by happily for the Boxcar Children. They found more treasures in the dump, and Henry worked every day for Dr. Moore. One noon, Henry came home with some new stockings for Benny. Benny was very happy about them and made everyone admire them. And when Jessie looked at the new stockings, she had a happy thought. She carefully washed Benny's old stockings and hung them up to dry. That afternoon, she and Violet sat down, with the work bag between them, to make a bear for Benny. "You must make a tail too, Jessie," begged Benny, watching her put on the arms and the legs and the head. "Bears don't have tails," said Jessie. "Your old bear didn't have a tail." "But this bear must have a tail," replied Benny, knowing that Jessie would put on 2 tails if he asked her to. "What kind of tail?" asked Jessie at last. "Long and thin," said Benny happily, "so I can pull it." "Benny!" cried Jessie, laughing. But she made a tail, long and thin, just as Benny had ordered. "What's its name, Jessie?" said Benny, when at last the bear was handed over to him. "I haven't thought about a name," replied Jessie. "Why don't you think up a nice name for him?" "Well, you made him out of my old stockings." "Let's name him Stockings." "All right, Stockings it is," agreed Jessie, trying not to laugh. And from that day on, the bear's name was Stockings as long as he lived, and he lived to be a very old bear indeed. One afternoon, Jessie saw how long Benny's hair was getting, and she cut it with Violet's scissors. Benny stood quietly while she did it. But while his sisters were getting supper, he said to himself, "Jessie cut my hair. I'll get Violet's scissors and cut Watch's hair. He will look better." He found Violet's scissors and made Watch lie down on his side. Then he began to cut the hair off. Benny said, "Good dog, Watch. You are Jessie's dog, so I will put a J in your hair. Hold still now." Watch laid still, and Benny began to cut a J. It was not a very good J, but it looked a little like one. Soon Benny had cut off all the hair on one side with a J in the middle. He stood admiring his work, and just then Jessie came to see what he was doing. "Benny," she cried, "what are you doing?" Then she began to laugh. "Oh, Violet, come and see," she called. "Watch looks so funny." Jessie laughed and laughed until she almost cried. Violet began to laugh more until she did cry. "You must go to bed, Violet." Violet was very sick. She helped her carefully into the boxcar and put pine needles all around her and under her, and she wet a handkerchief in the cold water of the brook and laid it on her little sister's hot head. "I wish Henry would come home," said Jessie. "What shall we do?" When Henry came at last, he looked at Violet and said, "Maybe she just had a cold." "Because she sat too long by the brook," he said. "If Violet is very sick, she ought to go to the hospital," said Jessie. "Yes, I know that," said Henry, "and we don't want her to go to the hospital if we can help it." "We should have to tell her name." "Yes," said Jessie, "then Grandfather could find us." The 2 older children sat up with Violet. They put cold water on her head, but after dark Violet shook all over, and Jessie was frightened. She covered Violet all over with pine needles, but still she shook. They couldn't get her warm. "I'm going to get Dr. Moore," said Henry. "I'm afraid Violet is very sick." Then Henry started to run. He ran even faster than he had run in the race. Down the hill, into the town he ran until he came to Dr. Moore's house. "Please come," he cried. "Violet is very sick." And the doctor said, "Come, get into my car." He didn't ask Henry which way to go, but the car went right up the road. When they came to the woods, he said to Henry, "Stay here in the car." He ran alone up the hill to the boxcar. It seemed like magic that he knew where to go. When Dr. Moore came back, he was carrying Violet in his arms. Jessie and Benny and Watch came too. They all got into the car. "Are you going to take her to the hospital?" asked Henry. "No," said Dr. Moore. "I'm taking her to my house." When they stopped at last, Dr. Moore carried Violet into the house and said to his mother, "Violet is very sick. We must put her to bed." Mrs. Moore hurried around, opening beds and bringing pillows, and Mary came from the kitchen with hot water bottles. After a while, Violet began to get warm. Then Mrs. Moore came to get the other children. "You must stay here all night," she said. She gave Henry and Benny a big bed, and Jessie slept in a little one. But Violet was so sick that the doctor did not go to bed all night. He would not leave her. He sat by her side until 10 o'clock in the morning. Before 10 o'clock, a man came to see the doctor. Mary told him he could wait, so he sat down in the living room. Soon Benny came in. "Where is the doctor?" asked the man crossly. "He is up in Violet's room," answered Benny. "This means $5,000 to him if he'll come down," said the man. "Oh, he can't come now," said Benny. "What do you mean, boy?" asked the man. "What is he doing?" "He is taking care of my sister, Violet," said Benny. "She is sick." "And you mean he wouldn't leave her even if I gave him $5,000? asked the man. "Yes," answered Benny, "that's what I mean." Then the man said, "You see, I have lost a little boy, and I think the doctor knows where he is. My little boy is just about as old as you are." "Well, if you don't find him, maybe you can have me," remarked Benny. "I like you." "You do?" cried the man. "Come and get up on my lap." Benny climbed onto the man's lap. "Have you got a dog?" he asked. "No," said the man. "He is dead now. But you can see him in my watch. Here it is." Benny looked at the dog. He looked like a good dog. "I have a dog," he said, too. "His name is Watch." Just then Watch came in with Dr. Moore. "Good morning," said Dr. Moore. "Benny, would you go and play with Watch?" Benny ran out, and the man said, "Dr. Moore, where are my grandchildren?" "That little boy is one of them," said Dr. Moore quietly. "That beautiful little boy?" said the man. "Yes," said Dr. Moore. "They are all good children, but they are afraid of you. They are afraid to let you find them." "How do you know that?" asked the man. "They have changed their name," said the doctor. He looked at the man in a strange way. "The big boy changed his name on field day. You saw him then." "I saw him? What did he change his name to?" asked the man. "Henry James," said the doctor. "The running boy?" cried the man. "The boy who won the free-for-all? I like that boy. So I am his grandfather." Chapter 12. James Henry and Henry James. Dr. Moore went to get his mother. "Mother," he said, "this is Mr. James Henry Alden. He wants to take his grandchildren to live with him." "I'm afraid they won't go with you," said Mrs. Moore, "until they learn to like you. And they won't want to go while Violet is so sick." "Can't I see them?" begged Mr. Alden. "I won't tell them who I am." "That would help," agreed the doctor. "If they grow to like you before they know who you are, things will be easier." "Yes," said Mrs. Moore. "Stay here with us for a while. The children will learn to like you, and then they will learn that you are their grandfather." "Thank you," said Mr. Alden. "I will go home and get some clothes and come back. I will give you the $5,000. But Dr. Moore would not take the money. "I just want these children to be happy," he said. When Mary learned that she was to cook for Mr. Alden, she was frightened. "How can I cook for him?" she cried. "He has everything. He's a very rich man." Here's a picture of chapter 12. "You can cook for anyone," said Dr. Moore kindly. "Just get one of your chicken dinners and have some cherry dumplings." At dinner, Mr. Alden saw all his grandchildren but Violet. He smiled with delight when he saw Jessie come in the room in her quiet way. "Children," said Mrs. Moore, "this is Mr. Henry." Benny laughed. "Henry and Mr. Henry," he remarked. "That is funny." Henry shook hands with Mr. Alden before he sat down at the table. "Where have I seen this man before?" he thought. The children liked to hear Mr. Henry talk. He told them about a big cucumber in his garden. The cucumber was growing inside a bottle, and he couldn't get it out. "Why not?" asked Benny. "It's too big," said Mr. Alden. "How did it get in?" asked Benny. "It was a little cucumber when it went in," said Mr. Alden. "A cucumber will grow just the same in a bottle. It will grow so big you can't get it out." "I'd like to see that cucumber," said Benny, stopping in the middle of his cherry dumpling. "Would you really?" asked Mr. Alden, delighted. "Some day you and I will go over and pick it." "And we can bring it to Violet," said Benny. "Yes, we'll bring it to Violet," agreed Mr. Alden. Henry thought again. "Where have I seen this man before? I wish I could remember." He could not remember, but he liked Mr. Alden very much. All the children liked him because he was kind to them. At last, one day, Mr. Alden could see Violet and went softly into her room with some beautiful flowers from his garden. The children loved him when he patted Violet's dark head and told her that he was sorry she had been sick. He told her, too, about his garden, where the flowers had came from. "I'd like to see your garden," said Violet. "I love flowers." "How long are you going to stay, Mr. Henry?" asked Benny. "Shh," said Jessie. "I want to stay here as long as I can, my boy," said Mr. Alden quietly. Henry looked at the man again. He knew that he had heard him say, "my boy," before. But where was it? He couldn't remember. After dinner, Mr. Alden sat under a tree reading. Henry was working in the flower garden in the front of the house. He looked at Mr. Alden again and again. Suddenly it came to him, as the man smiled over his book. "It is the same man who gave me the $25 prize and the silver cup," he said to himself. "I didn't remember him at first because I was so excited when we shook hands." He took another look and said, "It's the very same man." Henry sat thinking for a little while. Then he got up and went to find Dr. Moore. "Do you know who gave me the prize on field day?" he asked the doctor. "Do you know what his name is?" "James Alden of the Mills," replied Doctor. "J.H. Alden over at Greenfield." He did not look at Henry while he was saying it. Poor Henry was so surprised he almost fell over. That kind man was his grandfather. He went out and sat on the steps to think it over. To begin with, this man was too young. Henry thought of his grandfather as being an old man with white hair. And Mrs. Moore had called him Mr. Henry. Could it be that that man knew he was their grandfather and hadn't told them? Then he saw that Mr. Alden was getting out of his chair under the trees. "It's now or never," thought Henry. "I have to know." He walked eagerly after the man, who was going toward the garden with his back to Henry. Then the man turned around and saw how excited Henry was. "Are you James Henry Alden of Greenfield?" Henry asked. "I am, my boy," replied Mr. Alden with a smile. "Does that mean you know who I am?" "And I know that you are Henry James Alden?" "Yes," said Henry quietly. Then James Henry Alden shook hands again with Henry James Alden. Jessie and Benny came across the grass just in time to hear Henry say, "But, grandfather." Grandfather? Cried Jessie. What do you mean, Henry? Yes, said Jessie, and Henry eagerly said, He's the man we've been running away from all this time. I thought you were old, said Benny, and cross. Jessie said so. I didn't know, Benny, said Jessie. Her face was red. To think of running away from this kind man. But her grandfather didn't seem to mind. He patted her on the head and said, Let's go up and see Violet. There was no stopping Benny. He hurried to Violet's room, holding Mr. Alden by the hand and shouting, It's Grandfather, Violet, and he isn't cross after all. What do you mean? Asked Violet. Isn't he Mr. Henry? My name is James Henry Alden, he replied to her granddaughter. And my name is Henry James Alden, cried Henry. Well, well, said Dr. Moore. Violet held on to her grandfather's hand and listened to the rest talking excitedly. Where have you been living? Asked Mr. Alden at last. They all looked at each other, even Dr. Moore and his mother. Then they all laughed as if they would never stop. You ought to see, said Dr. Moore. What? Cried all the children at once. You never saw it in the daytime. Is that so? Laughed the doctor. I have seen it many times in the daytime. Seen what? Asked Mr. Alden. Our house, said Jessie. We've been living in a boxcar in the woods. Then they all began to tell him about the dump and the dishes and the brook and the swimming pool. They have 4 beds made out of pine needles in the car, said Dr. Moore. How do you know? Asked Jessie. Well, said Dr. Moore, the first day Henry worked for me, I walked up with him, behind him, as far as the hill. Why did you do that? Asked Mr. Alden. I liked him. I saw he was a fine boy, and I wanted to see where he lived. But you can't see the boxcar from the hill, said Jessie. No, but I came back that night and looked around, said Dr. Moore. About 10 o'clock? Cried Jessie. Yes, said the doctor. I stepped on a stick, and you heard me. Our rabbit, cried Jessie and Henry. Watch barked. Yes, I heard the dog bark, so I knew you were in the boxcar. Then I went home. But you came back? Asked Jessie. Oh, yes. When you were picking cherries, I went up to see your house. I wanted to see if you had enough of everything and enough dishes. Why didn't you tell me? Asked Mr. Alden. Didn't you know they were my grandchildren? The doctor laughed. Yes, I did, but they were having such a fine time. I didn't want to tell them. They got along very well until Violet got sick. Then I told you. I'm glad you did, said Mr. Alden. I have seen your house too, said Mrs. Moore. I went up one day and saw all your dishes. I liked your big pitcher and teapot. All of you have seen it but me, said Mr. Alden. We'll show it to you, cried Benny. I'll show you my cart made out of wheels and my pink cup. Good for you, Benny, said his grandfather, much pleased. When Violet gets well, we'll all go up there. If you will show me your house, I will show you my house. Do you have a house? Asked Benny in surprise. Yes, you can live there with me if you like it. I have been looking for you children for a long time. Violet was soon well again, and one afternoon they all started off to see the boxcar. The doctor took them in his car. Many people looked out their windows to watch Mr. Alden and his grandchildren. They were glad that the children had found such a kind man after all. When they arrived at their old home, they ran around all talking excitedly. Watch sniffed and sniffed all around, looking for the bone he had buried. Everything was the same. Here's the dam for the pool, said Henry to his grandfather. See our building, shouted Henry. For that was what he always called the fireplace. It really burns too, shouted Benny. And this is the refrigerator in the waterfall, and here is my pink cup. They all stepped on the stump and climbed into the car. They looked at the 4 beds and the dishes. Here is the same old pitcher and teapot, said Jessie, laughing. They found the blue tablecloth, and they sat down by the brook and ate chicken and bread and butter and cookies. Benny drank milk from his pink cup. "Come, we ought to go now," said Dr. Moore at last. "The sun is going down, and I don't want Violet to take any more cold." They closed the boxcar door and said goodbye, but they were all very sorry to go. "Tomorrow," said Mr. Alden, "will you all come over and see my house?" "Oh, yes," cried the children happily. They didn't know what a beautiful house it was, and what good times they were going to have in it. Okay, now I'm going to turn, and I'm going to have you see me read the last chapter. It's kind of dark in this room. I thought I had better light. Well, not too bad. I want you to see my t-shirt, though. It says, "Teaching makes me happy, happy, happy." And you've all made me very happy this year. Thank you. Chapter 13, A New Home for the Boxcar. The children's grandfather wanted them to like his house. He wanted them to live with him all the time. Here's a picture of the old boxcar. So he had made over some of the rooms just for them. The children went in his car to see the house. When the car stopped in front of it, Henry cried in surprise, "Do you live here in this beautiful house?" It was a beautiful house. It was very big, with many trees and flowers and gardens around it. "You may live here too, if you like my house," remarked his grandfather, watching Henry's face. The house was beautiful inside too. There were flowers everywhere. There were maids everywhere. The children went up to the bedrooms. "Oh," cried Jessie, "this is Violet's room." It really was Violet's room. There were violets on the wallpaper. The bed was white with a violet cover. On the table were flowers. "What a beautiful room," cried Violet, sitting down in a soft, pretty chair. All the children shouted when they saw Benny's room. The wallpaper was blue, covered with big rabbits and dogs and bears. There were a rocking horse and a toolbox and little tables and chairs, and an engine stood on a track with cars almost as big as the little boy himself. Benny ran over to the engine. "Can I run this train all day?" he asked, and he sat down on the floor by the engine. "Oh, no," said Henry. "You're going to go to school as soon as it begins." His grandfather laughed. "That's right, my boy. You will like school, and you will learn to read." "Oh, I can read now," said Benny. In Jessie's room they found a bed for Watch. It was on the floor by her bed. Watch was in at once, sniffing the pillow, turning around 3 times, and lay down. "He liked it," said Jessie. "He will sleep by me." Just then the children heard a doorbell ring. A maid came up to find Mr. Alden. "A man here to see you," she said, "about the dog." Now when Jessie heard the word dog, she was frightened. She was afraid it was about Watch. "They won't take Watch away," she whispered to Henry. "No, indeed," said Henry. "We'll never, never give him up." Henry and Jessie and the other children went down with their grandfather to see the man, and Jessie was more frightened than ever. Watch did not growl at the man. He jumped up on him delightedly. "You see, he was my dog," said the man, "but I sold him to the lady, and he ran away from her that very day. I have to turn him over to the lady I sold him to." "How do you know he is the same dog?" asked Mr. Alden. "Oh, he's my dog," said the man. "You see, he knows me, and he has a small black spot on his foot. But someone has cut his hair on one side." Benny looked. He found the black spot on Watch's foot. "I never saw that spot before," said Henry. "I will give you what you want for the dog," said Mr. Alden. "The children want him, and they want to keep him." "But I sold him to a lady," said the man. "I must take the dog to her." Then Henry said, "Maybe she will want to change to another dog when she sees his hair. If she will agree to take another dog, will you let my grandfather have this one?" "Yes, I will," said the man. "Let's go and ask her, grandfather," said Benny. "She will let Jessie have Watch. He is her dog. She took the thorn out of his foot." The man told Mr. Alden where the lady lived, and they all started out to find her. She was a pretty young lady, and she asked them to sit down. But Benny couldn't wait. He said, "Please let us keep watch. I want him and Jessie wants him. We didn't know it was your dog." "What do you mean?" asked the lady, laughing. "Who is Watch?" "This dog is Watch," answered Henry. "A man came to grandfather's house today and told us he had sold the dog to you. Then Watch ran away from you the day you bought him, and he came to us. He had a thorn in his foot, and Jessie took it out." Watch looked up at the lady and wagged his tail. When she looked at him, she began to laugh. "Look at his side," she said. "Who cut his hair?" "I'm sorry," said Henry. "Benny did that one day with Violet's scissors." "I'm not sorry," said the lady, laughing. "He looks so funny. And you want to keep him, is that it?" "Oh, yes," said Jessie eagerly. "The man will let us have him if you will take another dog." "Don't be afraid," said the young lady. "You may keep the dog. I can change to another one." "Oh, thank you. You are nice," cried Benny. She ran to the lady and climbed up on her lap before anyone could stop him. "I'd like to keep you, Benny, in place of the dog," laughed the lady, putting her arms around him. How happy the children were to have Watch to keep. Mr. Alden gave the money to the man at once. 4 happy children sat with their grandfather around the Alden dinner table that night. The maids smiled at in the kitchen to hear the children laugh. And the children laughed because Watch had a chair at the table beside Jessie, and he was waited on by a maid. Would you ever think that 4 children could be homesick in such a beautiful house? Jessie was the first one to wish for the old boxcar. One day she said, "Oh, grandfather, I'd like to cook something once more in my dear old kettle in the woods." "Go out in the kitchen, my dear," said her grandfather. "The maids will help you. You can cook all you want." Jessie liked this, but it was not like the old days in the boxcar. Then one day Benny said, "Grandfather, I wish I could drink milk out of my dear old pink cup." His grandfather began to think. He had some pink cups, but they were not so dear to Benny as his old cracked one. At last Mr. Alden said, "I'm going to give you children a surprise." "Is it very nice?" asked Benny. "No, not very," laughed his grandfather. "It isn't pretty at all." "When will it come?" asked Benny. "It will come today. You children must all go over to Dr. Moore's and stay until the surprise comes." "What can it be?" wondered Violet. Her grandfather laughed. "I hope you will like it. It is very heavy." The children were glad to see sweet Mrs. Moore and the kind doctor again. They stayed until Mr. Alden said the surprise was ready. Then Dr. Moore and his mother went back with them in the big car. Mr. Alden was as happy as a boy. He took them by the garage and through the big gardens. At last they came to a garden with a fountain in the middle and trees around it. Near the fountain was their surprise. It was the old boxcar. The children ran over to it with cries of delight, opened the door and climbed in. All the things were in place. Even the old dead stump was there to step on. Here was the old knife which had cut the butter and bread and vegetables and firewood and string. Here was Benny's pink cup, and there was his bed. Here was the big kettle and the blue tablecloth. Here were the pitcher and the old teapot. And here was the dinner bell which the children had made from an old tin can. Benny hung it on the tree with a string and rang it over and over again with a spoon. Watch rolled on the floor of the car and barked and barked. He began to sniff at everything. "He's looking for the bone he buried," laughed Benny. "Oh, how they love the old boxcar," said Mrs. Moore. I like to see them happy." "Thank you for the surprise, grandfather," said Violet. "We will never go away from you again." "I hope not, my dear," said Mr. Alden. "We'll all live happily ever after." And so they did. And here's the last picture. Boys and girls, there are many, many Boxcar Children adventures If you want a good book this summer, go to the library and check out any of the Boxcar Children. It is written by Gertrude Chandler Warner. I think she's written like 50 of them. So there should be a book that you should be interested in.